Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, and this is the next video wherein we are going to discuss about a new topic in Java which is called as super method. Well, I would say super method is quite useful. It's super useful when it comes to Java because most of the projects that we work with, we use the concept of inheritance as well as the constructors, and that's where it comes into the picture. So it's going to be quite beneficial for you to have a good understanding about super methods. So in this video, I'll be covering up everything about super methods as well as a special case. So that, because that kind of an error that I'm going to be discussing in this video is something which comes into the picture and it needs to have some good understanding so as to remove that. And also it's going to be useful for you to have the understanding properly because you should be aware of that why exactly it is coming, and in this video we're going to be discussing about the same. So without further ado, let's get into the system. So this is my Eclipse screen. And in order to explain you everything in detail about super methods, I'm going to be keeping it as very simple, and I'm going to be using a very simple example for that. So firstly, we're going to be creating two different classes, and the classes we're going to be using the concept of inheritance as well. So for that thing, I'm going to be keeping one parent class. That's going to be my father class, and the second class is going to be something called as son, and that's going to be my child class, right? So inside of these two classes which we have created, right, I will be just creating a constructor first because that's where we're going to be using the concept of super method. So the father class is going to be having the constructor named as father, and the definition of the father constructor is going to be simple, which we're going to be just printing out certain things. So that will be saying I am father, that's it. And the second thing what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be creating the constructor of the son class. So we need to have a very simple definition once again for this particular constructor, and that's going to say I am son, right? That's pretty much it. So far now what we have done is we have just the super demo as our main class having the main method, and the second thing that we have done is we have created two different classes. One is the parent class. So this is my parent class, and right, and the second class, which is my child class, actually it needs to have something called as extends, just to extend the father class, because that's where it's going to be inheriting all the properties of the parent class. That's what we want, right? So this is my child class. So now that we have done so far, we have created two different constructors in these two different classes, right? And we are also using the concept of inheritance. So let's do one thing. Let's call these constructors. I mean, we're going to be creating the objects, and that's where it's going to call the constructors, right? That's what happens when we create the objects. Its constructors will be called by itself, right? That's what's going to happen. So far, let's first of all create the object of father class, and I'm going to be keeping it as father parent equals new father, right? So we are just creating the object of the father class, and let's see what's going to happen. What's the output that we're going to be getting? So as of now, you're pretty much aware of that. It's going to be calling the constructor, and let's see the output. It's going to simply say I am father, right? That's it. That's what we want. And the next thing what we're going to be doing is that, let me just comment this out and let's see the modification and different kind of a thing which is going to happen. So let's just create the object of the son class, right? And I'm going to be keeping it as simple, just going to be creating a new son. All right, so we have created the object for the son class as well, and let's see the output now. So what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be running the code, and let's see what's the output is going to come. So yes, what's going to happen and what is happening over here. So it is saying I'm father, I am son. So that means both of the constructors which are defined in these two classes, because we are using the concept of inheritance, and son is extending father. That means son is a child class, right? And it is calling both of the constructor. Why is it happening? The very simple answer is that as it is adapting and it is having all the qualities and the properties of the father class, that's the reason it's giving the priority to the father class, to the father constructor initially. Why is it happening? Because even if we don't mention anything inside of the constructor, even if we don't mention anything inside of the constructor of the son class, it is having a method which is called as our super method. And that's the whole thing which is going on, and that's what the meaning of the super method is. So basically what happens is, whenever we create the object of the son class, definitely it's going to come initially to the son constructor, to the constructor of the son class. But what happens is, even if we don't mention anything over here, even if I'm not mentioning anything over here, which is the super method, which is there by default, even if we don't mention it, it's gonna be redirecting the code firstly to the father constructor, which is a constructor of the parent class. That's what it is happening. This is a default method which is there inside of the child class, child constructor every time. That's what it is happening, and that's the reason it's printing the output of the father constructor first, and then it is coming back to the second line, to the very next line of the super method. And yes, that's the reason the very first thing which is happening is I am father and then I am son. That's what it is happening. So let's try to do certain modifications over here, and then we see what's the output is gonna get changed, right? So this time I will be creating two different constructors inside of both of the classes. So this time, in order to make a change, because we know that we can create n number of constructors inside of class, right? That's what we know. So in order to make a difference, I will be just creating a constructor which is accepting some parameters. So this is my parameterized constructor for the father class. So for that thing, what I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to be keeping the definition is simple. Father age is, right? The very simple definition of the father constructor. And the next thing which I'm going to be doing inside of the son class is going to be the same thing. So I'm going to be creating a new constructor, and it's going to be also having the same thing. So there will be a parameter int age, and I will be doing the same thing. I'm going to be printing the age of the son, right? So it's going to say son age is, and it's going to be printing the age of the son. That's what we want, right? So these are the two constructors that we have created so far inside of both of the classes, the parent class and the child class. So in order to call these constructors, what we need to do, as of now, we have only called the constructor of the child class with no parameters, and that's the reason it's pointing out to the constructors which is having no parameters for both of the classes. And this time what I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to be calling the constructor, I'm going to be pointing out to the constructor which accepts the parameters. So I will say that the son age is going to be 15. So this time it should be pointing to the constructor which is accepting the parameters, right? That's what we want, and that is going to happen, right? So let's see, if I'm pointing to the constructor which is accepting the parameters, let's see what's the output is going to change. If we are pointing to the constructor which is having parameters, let's see what's going to happen for the parent class, which constructor it's going to call, whether the constructor which is having no parameters or the constructor which is having the parameters. That's what the main difference that we want to see, right? So let's execute the code and see the output. So as of now, you can see that definitely it's pointing to the constructor having parameters for the son class, but what is happening is it actually pointing to the constructor which is having no parameters for the parent class. Why is it happening? Like I mentioned previously, like we have seen in the previous case, that the super method is by default there, even if we don't mention it, right? That's the reason, even if we are calling the constructor with no parameters, it's pointing to the same constructor of the parent class having no parameters. Because by default, the constructor the super method which will be there inside of the constructor is gonna be the super having no parameters. So super is basically, just nothing. It's actually pointing to the constructor of the parent class. That's what it is doing, right? So let's suppose if I'm going to be passing on certain parameters, let's say if I'm just passing 50, then it's going to point out to the constructor which is having and which is accepting parameters inside of the parent class. Let's try to execute this code and see what's going to happen. So this time, inside of the parameter constructor of the child class, I'm just mentioning super 50. So let's see what's going to happen now. I'm executing the code, and you will see that both of the, so father age is 50 because I'm passing 50 inside of the super method, and son age is 15, right? That's what we are passing over here. So that's the reason both of the constructors are getting called having parameters. So imagine for a fact, like previously we had seen that we can also point out to the constructor which is not accepting the parameter. So let's try to make a difference over here. So this time I'm going to be calling the constructor which is not going to be accepting any of the parameters, because I'm creating the object having the constructor with no parameters. And let's suppose inside of this constructor which is not accepting any of the parameters, I want to call the constructor once again which is accepting the parameter. So this time I'm just keeping the age, because it's going to be just accepting any of the parameters that we want, right? Int age is something just a general variable, so we can pass on anything that we want to inside of the super method. So let's suppose I will be having one more constructor inside of the father class which is going to be accepting 2, 3, 4 parameters. So basis on that we can point out to the specific constructor of the parent class by passing the different parameters and passing on, like let's suppose if I'll just having two different constructors, one is having 70, 50, or you can say 75. Any of the numbers which I'm going to be passing over here inside of the super method, it's going to be pointing out to the same constructor of the parent class having the same analogy, or whichever it's going to be accepting the same number of parameters. So that's what we want. Let's try to execute the code and see the difference over here. It's pretty much simple, right? Because as of now, I'm sure you must be having the basic understanding about the super method, that why exactly it is happening in this way, because we just have to point out to the constructor of the parent class depending upon the parameters it is accepting, and we can also point out to the constructor of the child class basis upon the parameters that we want to pass at the time of object creation. That's pretty much it about super method, and it's not very much difficult. But there is a different case which comes into the picture. Let's suppose, let me just do certain modification, and like I mentioned, I'm going to be explaining you a certain kind of an error that comes when we use the super method. So that's what we're going to be looking at now. So just imagine for a fact, these are the two. So let's just remove this super method as of now and see the error which is going to come. I will explain you what's going to happen, right? Let me just comment this out instead of removing it. And what we're going to be doing is that, so we'll be just removing the constructor which is going to be the default one. Okay. So you can see this is the error which is coming. So this is the main error which I wanted to point out over here. So what I've done so far is that that inside of the child class, inside of the son class, we have two different constructors. It is having both of the constructor with parameters and which is the one which is having no parameters. So both of the constructors are defined inside of this particular child class. But coming back to the main class, coming back to the super class, the parent class, you can see we have only one single constructor which is defined, which is accepting the parameters. So what is happening is, inside of a class, if we define any kind of a constructor with parameters or with no parameters, because originally what happens, let's imagine for a fact, we have created a class and we have not defined any of the constructor. So in that case, the system actually, gets a constructor. There is a default constructor which is always there in every class, which is having no parameters and having no definition. But as soon as we create a constructor inside of a class with parameter, with no parameters, the default constructor, the default definition the default constructor from a class is actually something which is removed, right? That's what happens. But now what we have done is we have created a constructor which is accepting certain parameters, and that's the reason the default constructor has been removed. It's having no definition. So this is the only constructor that we have to keep in our mind. But now what we have done is that while we are creating the object for the child class, son child equals to new son, it's going to be pointing out to the constructor which is having no parameters, right? So it's coming to this particular point. But now, in order to find the definition, because as of now we haven't mentioned anything called as super, right? We haven't done anything over here. So it's actually trying to find the constructor which is having no parameters, because by default we have this thing, but it's not able to find any of the constructor which is not having any of the parameters inside of the parent class, and that's the reason we are getting this kind of an error. So let's try to understand what's the error that we are getting. Right? So the error, let me just remove this for a moment and let's see the error that we are getting. So this is the main point, because this is something which people tend to ignore and they just don't try to understand what is happening, why exactly this kind of an error is coming. So the error is saying implicit super constructor father is undefined, must explicitly invoke another constructor. So what it is saying that implicit superconstructor, which is father, having no parameters, is undefined, right? So this is something which is undefined. So the system is saying that explicitly invoke another constructor, because we still have a constructor inside of the parent class. So it is saying that explicitly invoke another constructor. So in order to get this error removed, what I can do is that I can simply just say, so let's do it in this over here first, and then we will try to rectify this error inside the previous one. So let's just explicitly call a different constructor, and now you can see that boom, this has been removed, right? So that's what it is happening, because explicitly we are calling a different constructor, but as soon as I remove this particular super 50 from here, it's going to give me the same error that explicitly you need to mention a constructor which needs to be called, because every time the object is going to be created for the son class, it's going to try to find the constructor for the main class, for the super class, and if it is not there, definitely it's going to give the error. And the error that I wanted to mention, that is something quite of a important point that you need to keep in your mind, because this is something which comes into the picture. Let's suppose as of now we are only creating a project with only just 10-20 lines. So in order to get this removed, you need to keep something in your mind that you call the super method properly, so as to a proper constructor will be called, and basis on that you don't get any kind of an error or any kind of a stoppage inside of your code, inside of your project that you're working on. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope I was able to explain you the things in a proper way. Just to summarize the things, just keep something in your mind that the default super is going to be always there inside of every single class, that every single child class that you create. And when we are creating the object for the child class, it's definitely going to redirect to the constructor of the parent class. And in order to the proper constructor for the parent class has to be defined, so that we don't get any kind of an error. And if we get an error, then needs to be explicitly called a proper constructor having proper parameters passed, so that we don't get the error, right? So that's the main point which I wanted to mention over here. And yeah, that's pretty much it about this particular simple example. And yes, that's the only thing that is there. So that's it from my side, guys, and I hope you liked the video. Thanks for watching the video. See you next time. Goodbye.